Here we are, deep in our deep dive series now. We're almost halfway through, I think, with most of the teams. And we get to a very interesting team here with the Chicago Cubs, given, I mean, so much about their franchise, I feel like, transformed when they won that World Series in 2016. The identity of the Chicago Cubs was forever changed when they won that World Series, because they're no longer the same lovable losers that they always were for all those years as soon as they won that World Series.
I guess they were the lovable losers even in Chicago. And before the podcast, we talked about, well, they're a 3 World Series winning team, although we'll talk about that in a moment. And we're going to do the White Sox after this.
Right.
But the White Sox kind of came in, and because they hadn't won since 1917 when they won in 2005. So the Cubs already were older than that,
Right.
from 1908.
And then the White Sox won in 05, and now it's just them. And the Red Sox has shed their curse the year before,
Right.
so they were really outside. The only team that was kind of close to them was then Indians, now Guardians, but they really weren't in the same class as the Cubs. And so, I mean, they're a very interesting franchise when you look at it because they're an original MLB franchise.
Right. They were actually founded in 1876 as the Chicago White Stockings, which is kind of like the White Sox, but they're not the White Sox. They're the Cubs.
No.
Okay.
And then they've played in the what was Chicago Cub Park for a while.
Yeah, they're not playing in the original ballpark, obviously, that they started playing in back in the late 19th century. But they did move into what is called Wrigley Field today. It was called Weigman Park because the guy's name was Weigman. And Wrigley Field wasn't called Wrigley Field because they built a minor league park in Los Angeles called Wrigley Field, and that's where they had all the minor league teams play there. And so they eventually decided to change the name in Chicago from Cubs Park to Wrigley Field in 1926, this being the 97th anniversary of that as we record here today.
And obviously with Wrigley Field, I think, which is really one of the most, if not the most iconic thing about the Cubs.
You have been there?
I have been there. It is a beautiful place to watch a ball game. And then you have their most famous part of that is the ivy backdrop on the outfield wall, which was commissioned by Bill Veeck, right?
Right. And you don't even think of him associated with the Cubs that much, but that's exactly
right.
The
And
case.
that's obviously a big part of that because so much, I think, if you really think about the Cubs, not necessarily the park itself, because I think the Red Sox fans would certainly beg to differ if we said that the Wrigley Field is the most iconic ballpark.
It is older than Fenway.
But in terms of core to the identity of the team,
Yeah.
Wrigley Field and the view from home plate looking out into the city over the ivy, I think, is so much a part of the Chicago Cub identity, in playing there and playing your games in that stadium means so much that I think that it's tied to the team in a way where I think you almost can never move that team. If that team isn't playing in Wrigley Field, it will not feel like the Cubs.
I completely agree. And your sister lived around the corner from Wrigley Field for a number of years, and she went to some games, being a baseball fan to some degree. And I remember her saying that she would go to some apartments nearby, and you can actually see into the park from some of these apartments. And that's a sort of a unique thing about Wrigley Field. I don't know any other ballpark that's like that.
Right. And I think with the Cubs getting into them and their history, this is definitely one of the deep dives that's a little bit more fun to get into just because you've got so much more time to play with. They are an original team to the league. They have so much time. They stretch back into into funny baseball time, where you've got a bunch of guys that are in the Hall of Fame when they hit 12 home runs, one of which we will be talking about today.
That wasn't even during funny baseball.
Right, no. But you've got guys back from they were playing when, the Cubs have a bunch of championships, and I think some of them are from the 70s, and by that we mean the 1870s.
Well, they didn't win anything until the 1907 World Series, and they won in 08. But they made the World Series a bunch of times. They won the pennant a bunch of times when they didn't have a World Series. So in Baseball Reference, it says they've got 17 pennants and, as we know, 3 World Series. So I'm counting. I'm trying to figure out all the World Series that the Cubs were in. That's how they lost in 1906, the year before, to the White Sox. They lost in 1910, 1918 to the Red Sox, 1929 to the A's, 1932 to the Yankees, 1935 1935 to the Tigers, 1938 to the Yankees, and 1945 again to the Tigers. So they lost all those things. But I'm adding them up. Well, that's not enough.
It's not 17.
That's not 17. So I had to go back and look at it. And so they list in Baseball Reference, like in the very early days, they were the first place team, but there was no World Series.
Right.
They won the pennants.
So they won, but there just wasn't some
But there
kind
was
of...
nobody to play because there was no other
They
league
didn't do
really to
that.
play. So
Right.
didn't do that kind
They
of
won technically.
and what's also really surprising to me is they have a winning record all time, and so we think of the Cubs as sort of like, well, they had all those years of futility, but you think about all those World Series that I was just saying that they lost even through the 30s, and then nothing for a long time. That's what we remember.
Right. That's what I remember as a baseball fan. But if they were in the World Series, so the thing is, it's much more likely to have a team that's from that earlier era of baseball to have a positive win-loss record, despite not having a lot of World Series, because one, you played during the time of the Yankees, so they just kind of took up a lot of those. But secondly, you could be finishing above 500 and doing well every year and not having a lot of playoff and pennant titles to show for it, because only one team got that. So, you could have had an amazing season, got 95 wins, except another team got 96. You're
out.
You're out. Didn't matter. Try again next season.
So yeah, they had one of their incarnations, as the White Stockings when they started. They had a 647 winning percentage, so they made the conscious decision to change the name. Okay, you win 65% of your games. Why would you change the name? They became the Colts, the Chicago Colts. Nobody knows about them. That was still before 1900, and then finally they're called the Chicago Orphans.
Wow, that's easily the worst name of the bunch.
At the end of until 1901, so just for 4 years, and then here's the thing:
then they abandoned that name,
right? And so they were kind of called the Cubs, but they weren't officially called the Cubs until 1904, even though they were kind of called the Cubs. So they're just called Chicago for 4 years. They don't have a nickname.
Chicago.
We're going to look at Baseball Reference. You can find this. Just says Chicago. Yeah, we don't really know what they were called because they had a lot of names. There was
different
another
people
name
called
too.
them different things.
Right, exactly.
Kind of like
they
their
were called
name,
the Infants.
Kind of like their namesake. Those orphans had a lot of names.
They were called the Infants and the Remnants.
That's just sad.
Before officially becoming the Cubs in 1907 was the official year they became the Cubs, even though here in Baseball Reference they say it's 1904 for the Cubs. So, and the thing about that, so they've got a winning record, have a great start to the franchise. We talk about the World Series, and we'll talk about the early 1900s World Series. But they don't have as many all-time players, and we'll get to that as you think they would have.
Right, like we were talking about that, and just if we start going around, we start naming like the most famous
They have a lot
of players, but they really only have one at a lot of the positions. And then at some of them, it's kind of like, there's not any. Like, the greatest Cub pitcher of all time.
Who would I say?
Yeah, who would you say?
I would probably, only because I did a lot of research for this. And so there were two guys I kind of have as a tie when we talk about that. I have Ferguson Jenkins, who when I was a kid, he was the dominant pitcher on the Cubs in 1969 when they were battling the Mets for the pennant, the division that year. And he had a great career with the Cubs and after the Hall of Fame pitcher. And Three-Finger Brown. Mordecai Brown.
That's a baseball name.
That's a baseball name. Mordecai Brown. He lost his finger in an accident as a kid, and part of one finger and almost the entire other finger. So he had unusual spin on his ball. And if you ever look up his Hall of Fame stats, this guy was fantastic.
Right. And I think that's kind of what's interesting if you look at the pitcher position, because there's a bunch of guys I can think of that have had unbelievable seasons for the Cubs as pitchers. Kerry Wood had an unbelievable season. Mark Pryor had unbelievable seasons. You had Justin Steele, and you had an unbelievable season this year. And,
I think Kerry Wood had the 20 strikeout game, obviously. I think when he got injured and he came back as a closer one year and he closed for them. I think that was really cool. He probably had more years with the Cubs than we think that were pretty good years, but he wasn't the phenom.
I'm blanking on his name right now, but he was just recently, he was a Cy Young candidate a couple years ago. And he had that unbelievable second half.
Arrieta.
Yes.
Jake Arrieta.
You had Arrieta.
Wasn't there that long.
Right, but I'm not saying that they were there that long, but they've had a series of years where they've had unbelievable performances from a pitcher. But I can't think of any, Hendricks is probably the guy I can think that's pitched the best for them over the largest number of seasons, because I can't really think of any other pitcher in my lifetime that's been there with them like that.
You'd be right, because just before your lifetime would be the two Ricks. Rick Russell before that, who if you look at his all-time stats, you think, wow, this guy was like a borderline, like, I didn't even think he was close to being a Hall of Famer, and then he is when you start like wow, he was way better. And Rick Sutcliffe, who also pitched a lot of years for the Dodgers, but he was a very, very good pitcher for the Cubs as well.
So, I mean, it's interesting because then you move over to first base and it gets hard because it depends if you want to cheat. Because you could say, well, technically Ernie Banks played like half his career at first base. You could consider him a first baseman and just put him over there, and then it's easy because, it's Ernie Banks.
It's except that you got to have a shortstop,
right?
And the shortstop is not all that robust.
Right. At least with first base, we have Mark Grace, who I think is.
I love that player.
But isn't he sort of the definition of Hall of Very Good?
Absolutely. He had a .303 career batting average at a time where it meant more as a first baseman who didn't have big power stats. So he was a contact hitter at first base at a time where
he got enough home runs.
Really good defender.
Right. He would have been a player that was more celebrated today.
Right. He had the misfortune of playing defense at the same time Keith Hernandez did.
Right.
So that could and Will Clark was a very good fielding first baseman and good first baseman at the same time. So there were contemporaries of him. But yeah, Grace over and so I think you have to compare the Cubs in terms of eras a little bit because I threw in Anthony Rizzo's name because I think Cub fans would probably say he's like an all-time Cub first baseman.
Probably just based on number of years.
Right. And we went to the game. You went to the game together with me and the family, and he hit 2 home runs against the Mets.
He did.
Right over our heads in the right field stands, actually. So anyway, the early Cubs when they went to the World Series in 1906 and 07 08, right? Mordecai Brown. So there's your pitcher, your primary pitcher, and then you had the Tinkers to Evers to Chance thing.
And that was who Chance?
So Frank Chance, first baseman, and so he would be the guy I probably would say. Because he played so long ago, it's really hard to say, well, he's the best first baseman the Cubs ever had. That's really hard to do.
And especially,
but he probably is.
Right, especially because it's a guy, you're not only saying this about a guy that basically nobody has ever seen play that's alive today, but we don't even have video. Like we don't even have like a stray clip of him.
Nothing. No. That's it. And so the Tinkers to Evers to Chance. This is a double play combination. So
there was a poem written about them, right?
Joe Tinker was the shortstop. Johnny Evers is the second baseman, and Frank Chance is the first baseman. And poet Franklin Pierce Adams wrote these words: Tinkers to Evers to Chance, trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinkers and Evers and Chance, ruthlessly pricking our gonfallen bubble, making a giant hit into a double, words that are heavy with nothing but trouble. Tinkers to Evers to Chance. And this was told about anybody who's like an older baseball fan, like you've heard these and things a million times. And what I didn't realize when I did a little bit more research is all 3 of them are Hall of Famers.
Right, which is impressive.
And that's really early, right? So that's the early part of the century. And when guys' stats like didn't really stat up to be in the Hall of Fame because Johnny Evers, I thought I had it. So he had 12 career home runs. Ooh. I said he has to be the position player with the fewest amount of career home runs. Who could hit less than 12?
Who hit less?
Ray Schalk.
How many?
Ray Schalk, he had 11. Ooh. Catcher, Hall of Fame catcher.
I guess those are
for the White Sox.
I guess those are the positions where you'd expect it to happen at short and at catcher.
But and so Evers also was known as just a miscreant, just a really unhappy person. The human crab was how
right,
he was.
But he has an unbelievable defensive WAR.
He is like 15th all time in defensive WAR, like 15, 16 runs a game or something like that, runs for his career. And so we were talking about that before this going. So exactly how do you think they evaluated D-WAR back in 1906? They didn't have any video replay.
Well, I think what it is I think they use WAR based off of like one particular year, like that they do have it for. So it's like you're completing off of the model of like whatever like a 19X player,
1906 player,
right.
1907 player would have,
right?
And so like they don't really have like his range factor,
right? How do you have that? Like so it's like I can understand like offensive stuff because you can derive that from the statistics,
pretty much.
But how do you derive that from the statistics? There isn't defensive statistics from back then, other than putouts.
So it makes, when you evaluate the all-time Cubs,
Really hard.
really hard, because these guys are among the greatest Cubs ever to play, and they played before any of us ever had a
Right, so
chance
we
to do
could-
anything but hear about
Right,
them.
theoretically, those three should be the lead at all of their positions because they were all Hall of Famers, and nobody else on this, none of the other guys that are at their positions could boast that, except for Ernie Banks.
Yeah, Ernie Banks is a special guy. But again, his big thing was he never got to play in a game that meant anything in the postseason in his entire career.
He suffered his whole
That's
career.
like 22 years for the Cubs and never got to the playoffs.
Right, and
Ouch.
part of the reason why he's so beloved there.
Right. So from 1945 until 1984, I think, when the Cubs lost the National League Championship Series to they lost to the Padres. They lost to the Padres won the World Series in '84, but the Cubs were very good in '84. That's a long time. That's almost 40 years without winning a pennant.
That's brutal.
So that's what I remember growing up as a kid. And then that 1969 year, I can name every player on the '69 Cubs because they were way ahead of the Mets, and the Mets had the famous comeback. But I was very aware of the team because of that, because they were the hated rival and the Black Cat.
They were the ones that were obviously.
So I got to
standing
see
on
Ron
top.
Santo play. So Ron Santo would be the third baseman. He's a Hall of Famer. And you look at his stats and you think, yeah, I guess that's a Hall of Fame career, right? And all that. Now, he was beloved, obviously, by Cub fans for he was a commentator there for years, and people loved the way he talked and his whole love for the Cubs, and really good guy overall and whatnot. So, but I mean, you start looking at the other third baseman in Cubs history,
It gets hard.
so I've been following this Stan Hack, who was a great Cub, played during just at the end of their 30s run of being kind of World Series teams that lost. So he has that for him. And then I had to go really deep to come up with Aramis Ramirez,
Oh wow, yeah, and
who had a much better career than you thought, but it ain't nothing like Ron Santo.
I feel like you can't be putting him anywhere close to the same level as a Hall of Fame player, or even a Hall of Very Good player. He's just like a solid player.
I don't know. If you look at his WAR, I think his career WAR is between 25 and 30 or something like that. Which it was more than I thought.
It's a good player.
Right. He was a really good player for a long time there. So that was difficult when it came to third base. And I don't think that Cap Anson belongs on any of these lists because we don't like Cap Anson very much. So he is the all-time Hall of Famer, leader WAR for the Cubs. So let's give him the acknowledgement. He was a player manager for the Cubs.
But his personal life and actions and personality leave a lot to be desired.
And Frank Chance actually was the player manager for the Cubs when they won their World Series
So they
in
had a lot
1907
of player
and 8.
managers.
Yes, and that was kind of the way that it was.
It was much
certainly
more common
way back
then.
during at the beginning. Probably trying to save a salary if you're the owner or anything like that.
And then you go to the outfield, and I think you have two pretty obvious choices in Sammy Sosa, who steroids and all, yes, but he was still a all-time
one of the
Cub.
great Cub outfielders of all time.
I think you have to talk about Andre Dawson, who wants to be in the Hall of Fame as a Cub.
And he only played 6 seasons there. So
he only played 6 for Montreal, though.
No, he played more for Montreal.
He played more for
Montreal.
I thought it was even.
I always think of him as an Expo over a Cub, but so the whole thing with him going to the Cubs and it was, he was very upset, was Dawson, and then he's trying to get his cap switched from the Expos, which the Major League made him go in as an Expo. I don't want to be an Expo. I've decided, I think about it, I want to be a Cub, because they embraced him in a way that, so the Expos wouldn't pay him, and they were kind of grinding him down. They made him take a pay cut even when he had a good year. And so he was so unhappy with that when he finally became a free agent. He got together with the Cubs, and the Cubs said, you write in whatever salary you would like to be paid to play for us. And so Dawson did something pretty cool. He wrote in $500,000,
So was that
which was not a stupid salary at the time. It was not ridiculous. And he won the MVP in 1987, hit 49 home runs, and had one of the great Cub batting seasons of all time. And then he got like a 4-year deal, or $2 million a year for a few years. So he got paid, so to speak, on the backside of it. And because of that, he loved the Cubs, and the Cubs love him.
Yeah.
So I think that's why he wants to do that. And we can get into a whole nother episode on like caps and how many guys are going in with nothing on their cap now, because the MLB is finally getting smarter about not forcing guys to go, you know what, we think you were an Expo. And
We're going to make it, you wear cap.
I don't want to go as an Expo. I'm sorry. You have to go in that way and wear that cap when you it's so silly to do stuff like that. So Andre Dawson, I think I would put up there. I think I would probably slide Hack Wilson, who also only played 6 seasons
but
in there.
It says something that where a lot of the guys we're pulling for this list are guys that played in like 1900.
1930 in Tack Wilson's case.
But still, that are before 1940. We're pulling all these guys to play all-time Cubs, which says a lot about what this Cubs team has had since that time period.
Right. I had to look up Riggs Stevenson, which is a name that I've heard, and actually really good career. Look at his career, way better career. Because he played there longer, I would probably rate him over Dawson only because he actually was a Cub.
He was a more impactful Cub.
But if you ask average Cub fans about Riggs Stevenson, I wonder how deep they go. And that's an interesting thing, right? Because we're Met fans, right? So it's pretty easy for the Mets. They've only been around 60 years. Right. You don't have to go back to 1910 to go, who the heck played third base for the Mets in 1910?
A guy that I never watch and never will watch.
Right. Who is this guy, and why is he one of the great guys of all time? So you have to kind of do your research and do that. Let's see. Other outfielder that I had at number 1 was Billy Williams, a Hall of Famer that you didn't get to see, obviously, play. He was on the 69 Cubs, and he played for them a lot of years before that. He's got 475 career home runs.
That's pretty good.
He's got 1,500 RBIs, batted nearly 300 for his career. So, again, an all-time great player that because the Cubs never won anything, people forget.
And I think it's so interesting that, them winning in 2016 I think in some ways has been both a good thing. It's been almost entirely a good thing, but there's a little bit of a bad thing in a way.
I know what you mean.
In that,
their identity has been sort of
their identity now that they've won that World Series, they haven't the Red Sox won that World Series and then won more. So now they were able to be reborn as a good team, and young fans and fans today, they look at the Red Sox as a good team. It's only the fans that are your age and older that look at the Red Sox as a team that isn't a successful, good team. Anybody that's my age has only ever seen the Red Sox win, whereas the Cubs, well, they got that one World Series in 2016. They got out from the curse, but that was it.
Well, and how about this? So we talked about the guys on the early 1900s team, the three infielders and the pitcher. So if you had to say, so who gets the legacy from being on the Cubs' other World Series winning team in 2016? Is it who's the Cubs, the everlasting Cubs that come out of that? Is it Ben Zobrist?
Is it Chris Bryant?
Is it Chris Bryant? The problem is that they only had the one, and a lot of those guys aren't with the Cubs even anymore.
Right. Is it going to be Kyle Hendricks just because he's the guy that
he's still there?
Around?
Yeah. So I think that makes it difficult, to look at that team because you want to kind of canonize some of the guys from the World Series winning team, but they don't really have those guys.
No, and I think that's part of the reason why that team isn't as talked about. We thought we were looking at what was going to be a dynasty, and then they just kind of fell apart.
And they had finished last in 2014. That's the amazing thing, right? They finished last in 2014. They somehow got a wild card in 15, and the Mets beat them in the playoffs.
Right. And
then they win the World Series, and an epic World Series. I think you and I feel that's if not the best World Series of all time.
5.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best World Series of all time. So relief pitcher. So the first thing that came to my mind, and I don't know if you know Bruce Sutter, and I was like, okay, so he pitched more for the Cardinals or the Cubs, and it was more for the Cardinals than he did the Cubs. So then I went to a guy that I hate to put number 1 of all time, who's in the Hall of Fame, who was
he's in the Hall of Fame,
and he also pitched for the Cardinals actually for a lot of years, and the Cubs. Lee Smith, as your number 1.
And why do you hate to put him in?
Because I think Lee Smith still kind of suffers from he was a compiler.
But he's in.
He's in, and he got a ton of saves.
I can't punish a guy for being a compiler if he's in the Hall of Fame.
And he was a feared closer for years for a team that didn't win everything. And that's the problem. He never got to the playoffs and the World Series very much. Or the World Playoffs very much.
You can't fault the guys that played for the Cub teams those years that they happened to play for the Cubs. I can't punish the team for being bad, being like, oh, well, you never pitched on a big stage. It's I can't blame the player for that.
No, and I think that he's got the cred. He did it mostly for the Cubs,
especially because I can't blame the player for that if I'm also going to romanticize staying with the same team for your whole career. And since I like that aspect of it, I can't criticize the other side of it.
So I looked at the manager, and because Frank Chance won 2 World Series, he wins.
Right.
Charlie Grimm was another great Cub manager through the 30s, a guy you probably never heard of. But they won 3 pennants under him.
And then Joe Madden has to get on there because he won a
World Series, but he would be third in my in my pantheon of Cub guys. So I think the the fact that you had like 100 years between World Series makes that period in between for the Cubs really hard to evaluate, because there was a lot of those years, like we said, of nothing, and so that fans kind of, if you're a fan who's my age, you think, well, yeah, they're the lovable losers, at least in your lifetime.
Right.
They won a World Series, when you were fairly
I
young.
think that is what's really interesting about both of the Chicago teams, really, is that, the White Sox won in 2005, the Cubs won in 2016, and then neither of them have had any success, really, since their World Series title wins. And so what are those team identities now? The Cubs are trying to put together a run. Right now, I think they're one of the leading candidates to go get Shohei Ohtani.
They got great counsel.
Now, if they go do that, they get Ohtani, they get counsel, then they're clearly trying to push after what was almost a playoff campaign this year. They're clearly then trying to push and make a playoff campaign next year, though I still worry that with what pitching.
Well, they got Justin Steele, as you said.
Right, but that's
and then they've got other guys.
They got other guys. So, but they're a team that's trying to push back in, but neither them nor the White Sox. What would you say the story of those two teams are over the last 20 years?
The last 20 years. Well, because the Cubs won a World Series, I think the Cubs are a much better position, and we'll talk about the White Sox in our next deep dive. They're in a much better place, even though the White Sox just a couple of years ago probably were in a better position than the Cubs.
I think it's interesting, but I think with the Cubs, they're hoping that 2024 could be their year. They're probably thinking that we're ready to make a run.
Yeah, I would think if I looked at that division now, if I'm the Cubs, I'm thinking it's the Reds and the Cubs, I think, that are at the top.
That are ready to make a move.
I think so, yeah. I think they're going to battle for the division this year. And the Cubs are probably going to make a lot of moves. They spent all this money on counsel and other. I think they're all in.
Not to go all in.
I think, and I kind of hope. I hope they go all in. And
it'll be more fun.
As long as they don't get Yamamoto, because I want him for the Mets.
Me too.